I came home from an exhausting business trip to find my mother wearing my custom silk robe, sipping my most expensive wine, and telling me to sleep on the couch because my sister needed my master bedroom. Then my father handed me a $4,500 credit card bill for my brother-in-law's new Rolex. They thought I was the same quiet pushover they had been stepping on for decades. They had no idea. I had already sold the penthouse out from under them to a paranoid cybersecurity billionaire. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to outsmart toxic family members who thought they owned you. My name is Elise and I am 33 years old. For years, I let my family treat my life, my home, and my bank account like their personal playground. I run a highly successful luxury real estate staging company in Chicago. It is a demanding career that involves transforming multi-million-dollar empty properties into breathtaking homes using museum-grade art and high-end antiques. Because of my work, I live in a stunning downtown penthouse. Or at least I did. It all came to a boiling point last Tuesday. I had just returned from a brutal 14-hour business trip to New York. All I wanted was a hot shower and my own bed. But when I unlocked my front door, the heavy oak swinging open, I froze in my tracks. The layout of my living room had been completely rearranged. My delicate velvet staging sofas were pushed aggressively against the wall to make room for a massive, ugly cooler. Standing in the center of my kitchen was my mother, Barbara. She was wearing my custom-tailored silk robe, the one I had treated myself to in Paris, and she was casually pouring a glass of my vintage red wine. Finally, she sighed, not even bothering to look guilty as she took a sip. Go grab a blanket and sleep on the couch. Caroline and Andre just got back from their couple's retreat in the Bahamas, and they are absolutely exhausted. They are asleep in your master bedroom right now, so try not to stomp around and wake them up. I set my suitcase down, staring at her in absolute disbelief. You gave my bedroom to my sister, I asked, my voice dangerously low. Barbara waved her manicured hand dismissively. Elise, do not start with your selfish attitude tonight. We raised you. The least you can do is give your younger sister a nice, comfortable bed when she needs one. You know Andre has been stressed with his real estate gigs. He needs his rest. Andre was Caroline's husband, an African-American freelance broker who cared infinitely more about looking wealthy than actually putting in the work. He and Caroline were the golden couple of the family. They were constantly pampered and praised by my parents, while my own achievements were treated as mere stepping stones to fund their lavish lifestyle. Before I could demand they leave my apartment, the door to my guest bathroom opened, and my father, Richard, strolled out. He walked right past me, completely ignoring my exhaustion, and tossed a crumpled receipt onto the kitchen counter. You need to pay this by tomorrow morning, he stated, his tone leaving absolutely no room for discussion. I picked up the paper. It was a credit card receipt for $4,500 from a high-end jeweler. What is this? I asked, feeling a familiar knot forming in my stomach. Richard poured himself a glass of water, leaning against the marble island. Andre needed a new Rolex to impress his elite clients. Your credit card is still linked to the emergency family account, so we used it. Consider it payback. Payback for what I demanded, my hands starting to shake with suppressed anger. Payback for the 3 months we let you live in our basement when you were a struggling design student, Barbara chimed in, adjusting my silk robe around her waist. We supported your little house decorating hobby, and now that you have some money, it is time to support your sister's marriage. Pay the bill, Elise. Do not make us remind you of what family loyalty means. A younger version of me would have cried. A younger version of me would have screamed, argued, and eventually given in to their relentless emotional manipulation. But standing in my hijacked kitchen, looking at my parents treating my home like a hotel and my bank account like a limitless charity fund, the final shred of my familial guilt simply evaporated. The golden child and scapegoat dynamic had controlled my entire existence, but tonight the spell broke. I did not yell. I did not throw them out. Instead, I pulled out my phone, opened my banking application, and paid the $4,500 credit card balance right in front of them. There I said, keeping my expression entirely blank, "It is paid." My father smirked, exchanging a victorious look with my mother. "See," Richard said. "Was that so hard? Being a good sister is your duty." Just as he said that, a notification popped up on my phone screen. It was an encrypted email from my real estate attorney. I tapped it open. The message was brief but beautiful. Billionaire Dominic Thorne has signed the all-cash contract. The funds are in escrow. The penthouse is legally his in exactly 48 hours. A slow, quiet smile spread across my face. Dominic Thorne was not just any buyer. He was a notoriously paranoid cybersecurity chief executive officer who needed an ultra-secure location in Chicago. He was paying millions in cash for my apartment, and more importantly, he was installing a military-grade security system the absolute second the title transferred. My family had no idea that the ground beneath their feet no longer belonged to me. I walked into the guest room, grabbed a single overnight duffel bag, and packed a few essentials. "Where are you going?" Barbara asked, frowning as I headed back toward the front door. "I thought I told you to sleep on the couch." "I have an early morning," I replied smoothly, masking the absolute thrill racing through my veins. "You guys go ahead and make yourselves comfortable. Stay as long as you like." I tossed my spare physical key onto the kitchen counter. It landed against the marble with a sharp metallic clink. "I will not be needing that anyway," I added. I walked out of the penthouse, the heavy door closing behind me, leaving them to their stolen comfort. They thought they had won. They thought they had successfully bullied me into submission one more time. They had absolutely no idea they had just locked themselves inside a ticking time bomb. The next morning, I woke up before 6, my mind already racing with the final steps of my exit plan. I dressed quickly in dark jeans and a plain sweater, avoiding the urge to look at the master bedroom door, where Caroline and Andre were still sleeping off their fake luxury lifestyle. I grabbed my small duffel bag and crept down the hallway, stepping quietly over the hardwood floors. Caroline stepped out of the master bedroom, pulling a plush silk robe tight around her waist. She planted herself squarely in the middle of the hallway, blocking my path to the front door. She held out a thick, multi-page document, waving it in my face with a condescending smirk. "My 30th birthday is this Sunday," Caroline announced, her voice carrying that insufferable pitch of pure entitlement. "I am hosting 50 people right here in this living room. I invited Andre's entire family, his parents, his cousins, everyone, just to show them our new lifestyle. I need you to hire a 5-star catering team and clear out all your ugly, dusty staging props by tomorrow afternoon." I stared at her, not even trying to hide my disdain. Before I could answer, the bedroom door opened wider and Andre stepped out. He was wearing a faded graphic tee paired with the $4,500 Rolex my father had just forced me to pay for. He leaned lazily against the doorframe, crossing his arms and looking down his nose at me. "Make sure you are nowhere near this place on Sunday." Elise, Andre chimed in, tossing his head back with an arrogant laugh. "Your depressing single woman energy is going to ruin the whole vibe. We are telling my family this penthouse belongs to us, and having you lurking around in your paint-stained clothes will embarrass Caroline." The sheer audacity of the two of them standing in my home wearing items bought with my money and ordering me out of my own property would have made the old me furious. But standing there knowing what was arriving in less than 48 hours, I felt an overwhelming sense of calm. The trap was set, and they were walking right into it with their eyes wide open. "Of course," I said, forcing a bright, cooperative smile onto my face. "Whatever you need, Caroline. I will make sure the place is completely out of your way for the party. You will not have to worry about me ruining your big moment." Caroline blinked, clearly taken aback by how easily I surrendered. She had prepared for an argument, ready to run to our mother to fight her battles. But seeing me nod obediently, her smirk returned tenfold. "Good," she sneered, snatching the list back. "Glad to see you are finally learning your place in this family." I turned toward the front door, pulling my bag over my shoulder. As I pressed the button for the private elevator, I could hear them laughing behind me in the hallway. "Can you believe her?" Andre chuckled loudly, his voice echoing down the corridor. "Total pushover. She is probably going to go cry in her car." The elevator doors slid open with a soft chime. I stepped inside and turned around, watching the two of them celebrate their pathetic little victory. The doors began to close, cutting off the sound of their laughter. The moment I was alone in the elevator cab, the pleasant smile vanished from my face. I pulled my smartphone from my coat pocket and opened my secure messaging app. I typed out a direct command to my head logistics manager at the staging warehouse. "Execute protocol." Alpha I typed, my fingers moving quickly across the glass. Empty the entire warehouse inventory to the new location today. Leave only the decoy staging furniture in the penthouse. I hit send. The elevator reached the ground floor, and as I stepped out into the crisp morning air, my phone vibrated with a response from my manager. Understood, boss. Moving crew dispatched. The penthouse will be completely cleared of real assets by noon. I walked out onto the street, heading straight for my lawyer's office to finalize the paperwork that would strip my family of everything they thought they owned. The law office was a masterclass in corporate intimidation. Floor-to-ceiling glass walls over the Chicago River, polished mahogany tables gleamed under modern lighting, and an oppressive silence filled the air. The kind of silence that costs thousands of dollars an hour to maintain. I sat across from Dominic Thorne, a man whose reputation preceded him. Dominic was not a traditional real estate investor looking for a luxury home. He was a 40-year-old cybersecurity mogul, a billionaire who made his fortune building impenetrable digital fortresses for government agencies and private banks. He did not want my penthouse for its panoramic city views or its custom Italian marble countertops. He wanted it because it occupied the entire top floor of a building with dedicated reinforced utility shafts, making it the exact perfect location to house his new array of private off-the-grid corporate servers. Dominic slid the final stack of purchasing documents across the table. His sharp, calculating eyes met mine. He did not smile. He operated with a level of paranoia that bordered on clinical, which was exactly why he was the perfect buyer for my particular situation. The funds are currently sitting in escrow. Dominic stated, his voice a low, even rumble that commanded the room. They will be released to your accounts the exact second the title officially transfers on Friday at exactly 5 in the afternoon. But I need you to understand something very clearly before we conclude this transaction, Elise. He leaned forward, tapping his expensive silver pen against the glass table. At 5:01 on Friday, my proprietary artificial intelligence security grid goes live. I am having a specialized team install the hidden hardware over the next 2 days while you finish clearing out your belongings. The moment that system is armed, the traditional physical locks on those front doors become entirely irrelevant. The penthouse will be secured by biometric scanners, thermal sensors, and titanium drop-down shutters. I sat perfectly still, absorbing every word. If anyone steps foot inside that apartment after 5 o'clock on Friday without my personal biometric clearance. Dominic continued, his tone deadly serious. The system will not just sound a loud alarm, it will instantly lock down the entire floor. It sends an immediate encrypted distress signal directly to my private armed tactical team and the Chicago Police Department High Threat Division. The system categorizes unauthorized entry not as simple trespassing, but as a live act of corporate espionage. They will come in fast and they will come in heavily armed. I did not flinch at his warning. In fact, a deep, profoundly satisfying warmth spread all the way through my chest. It was absolute music to my ears. I reached into my designer handbag and pulled out the 2 primary electronic key fobs, sliding them carefully across the polished wood table toward him. You have my absolute guarantee, Dominic, I replied, keeping my voice perfectly level and professional. My moving team is currently clearing out all of my valuable inventory as we speak. By Friday afternoon, there will be nothing left inside, but a few cheap decoy furniture pieces I plan to write off as staging losses anyway. The property will be entirely yours. I will be miles away, and I assure you no one with any legal right to be there will cross that threshold. Dominic studied my face for a long moment before giving a single curt nod. He picked up the electronic fobs and slipped them into his tailored suit jacket. He signed the final piece of paper with a swift, aggressive stroke of his pen. The deal was done. The $3.5 million was locked in, and the countdown had officially begun. I shook his hand, thanked my real estate attorney, and walked out of the glass-enclosed conference room. The bustling sounds of downtown Chicago greeted me as I stepped out onto the street. The crisp morning wind felt like absolute freedom. For the first time in my 33 years of life, I was entirely untethered from the financial and emotional anchors my parents had tied around my neck. As I walked toward my car, planning my drive out to the hidden suburban estate I had secretly purchased months ago, my phone vibrated in my pocket. I pulled it out and saw a new message in the family group chat. It was from my mother. "We are taking your spare physical keys down to the hardware store right now," Barbara wrote her tone, demanding and entitled even through a simple text message. "We need to make at least 5 extra copies for the caterers, the event planners, and Andre's parents, who are arriving early on Sunday. Do not even think about causing drama or trying to change the locks before the birthday party. Be a supportive sister for once in your life." I stopped on the sidewalk reading the message twice, just to savor the sheer arrogance radiating from her words. They were so confident in their control over me. They were so certain that my silence earlier that morning meant total submission. They were practically fighting each other to be the first ones through that door on Sunday, completely oblivious to the fact that they were forging their own prison keys. They actually believed they were taking over my luxury penthouse, having zero clue they were planning to break into a federally secured corporate data center. I typed out my response, my fingers moving deliberately over the screen, making sure my tone sounded exactly as obedient as they expected. "Take them all," I replied, adding a cheerful smiley face emoji to sell the illusion. "I will not be needing them anyway." I locked my phone, slipped it back into my coat pocket, and walked away to start my new life. Under the cover of darkness, my actual moving operation began. While my family was busy planning their glamorous weekend and fighting over who would get the best bedroom, a specialized, highly discreet logistics team arrived at the underground loading dock of my building. These were not your average movers. They were professionals trained to handle museum-grade inventory, the same crew I used for my highest-end real estate staging clients. Over the next few hours, they systematically stripped the penthouse of everything that held genuine value. We are talking about $500,000 worth of insured authentic staging assets. Original mid-century modern art pieces, imported Persian silk rugs, custom Italian leather sectionals, and hand-blown crystal chandeliers were meticulously wrapped and loaded into unmarked trucks. I stood in the center of the living room, directing the crew with quiet precision. With every valuable piece that went out the door, I felt a heavy burden lifting from my shoulders. They were transporting my entire livelihood, the physical proof of my hard work, to the sprawling, hidden suburban estate I had purchased months ago under a blind corporate trust. By 3 in the morning, the penthouse was entirely stripped of my real life. But an entirely empty penthouse would have raised immediate red flags. If my mother or Andre walked in and saw bare walls, their greed would quickly turn to suspicion, and they might accidentally discover the sale. I needed a flawless distraction. I needed to feed their egos and their absolute certainty that I was bowing to their demands. So the next morning, I hired a loud bargain rate cleaning crew to scrub the floors, polish the windows, and vacuum the carpets. I told them to make as much noise as possible, making it look exactly like I was obediently preparing the space for Caroline's massive birthday bash. More importantly, I brought in the decoys. From the deepest, dustiest corners of my staging warehouse, I pulled out the cheap, flashy knockoff decor I normally threw away or used for low-budget filler. I placed 2 massive, gaudy fake porcelain vases right by the entryway. I hung a series of incredibly tacky reproduction paintings in the dining room, the kind with overly shiny gold plastic frames. I placed a fake leather sofa in the center of the room. I knew exactly what I was doing. Andre had absolutely zero eye for actual quality, but he loved anything that looked loud, ostentatious, and expensive. He had eyed those exact fake vases months ago, hinting heavily that they would look great in his own living room. I was serving up the bait on a silver platter, giving them worthless garbage to covet and inevitably steal, while my real fortune was miles away, safely locked behind the iron-wrought gates of my new estate. By Thursday afternoon, as I was arranging my authentic artwork in my new home, my phone rang. The caller ID flashed with Andre's name. I let it ring a few times, savoring the control I now held before answering with a perfectly pleasant, submissive tone. "Elise, listen to me," Andre barked, skipping any form of greeting or basic human decency. "I need you to leave the keys to your vintage Porsche on the kitchen counter when you leave on Friday. I have some very important real estate clients coming to the party on Sunday, along with my parents, and I need to have it parked in the premium VIP spot downstairs. It completes the whole aesthetic of us owning the building. The sheer entitlement of the man was breathtaking. He was not asking to borrow my classic meticulously restored sports car that I had spent years paying off. He was demanding it as a prop for his fake billionaire lifestyle, completely expecting me to hand over the keys to a $100,000 vehicle just so he could lie to his family. I smiled into the phone, walking through the spacious, sunlit foyer of my new suburban home. "Oh, Andre, I am so sorry," I replied, making my voice drip with exaggerated disappointment. "The Porsche is actually in the shop this week. The transmission was acting up, and my mechanic said they needed to keep it over the entire weekend to wait for parts." I heard a sharp, furious intake of breath on the other end of the line. "You have got to be kidding me," Andre exploded. His voice echoed with genuine fury, dropping the polite brother-in-law act completely. "You are unbelievable, Elise. You knew this weekend was important to Caroline and me. You always do this. You always find some way to ruin things. You are a bitter, selfish spinster who cannot stand seeing anyone else happy or successful. No wonder you are entirely alone." He slammed the phone down, disconnecting the call. I lowered the phone, looking out through my massive bay windows at my private, lush backyard. I was not insulted. I was highly entertained. His anger only confirmed exactly who he was, a parasite throwing a tantrum because the host had finally cut off the blood supply. The next 24 hours passed in a state of absolute serene anticipation. I spent Friday morning organizing my real furniture in my new home, completely ignoring the family group chat, which was currently buzzing with Caroline's demanding party updates and my mother's complaints about my bad attitude. I poured myself a cup of premium coffee and sat at my large kitchen island, watching the digital clock on the wall. The seconds ticked away, the final moments of my old life, the final moments of their control over me. 4:58, 4:59, 5 o'clock. At exactly 5:01 in the afternoon, my smartphone lit up on the cool marble counter. It was a secure push notification from my private banking application. The screen displayed a confirmed wire transfer. $3,500,000 had been successfully deposited into my primary account. The title transfer was officially complete. Dominic Thorne was now the legal owner of the downtown penthouse. I took a slow, deep breath, feeling the last remaining chain fall away. I was completely financially liquid. My assets were secured, and the penthouse was now a heavily fortified federal data center. The physical keys my mother had stolen were absolutely useless against Dominic's newly armed biometric security grid. The trap was set, the bait was in place, and my toxic family was marching blindly toward their own spectacular destruction. Saturday morning arrived with a brilliant golden sunrise that poured through the massive windows of my new suburban estate. I was sitting on a plush lounge chair beside my private pool, the crisp morning air carrying the scent of pine trees instead of city smog. For the first time in memory, my shoulders were completely relaxed. The $3.5 million had cleared perfectly. The penthouse was gone. My authentic, $500,000 staging inventory was safely locked inside the climate-controlled vaults of my new home. All that remained was to watch the spectacular implosion of the people who thought they had broken me. My phone, resting on the glass table next to my freshly blended margarita, began to buzz. It vibrated once, then twice, then erupted into a relentless, continuous hum. I picked it up and unlocked the screen. The family group chat was going absolutely wild. Caroline had sent a high-resolution selfie. She was standing on the balcony of the penthouse wearing a designer silk dress she had likely purchased using our father's credit card. In one hand, she held a crystal flute filled with expensive champagne. Behind her, the sprawling Chicago skyline stretched out, providing the perfect backdrop for her fabricated billionaire lifestyle. The caption beneath the photo reads, "So glad the loser finally gave us some space, getting everything ready for the party of the century tomorrow." I took a slow sip of my margarita, letting the cold, salty rim bite my lips as I read the messages rolling in beneath her photo. My father, Richard, sent a string of clapping emojis adding, "You and Andre deserve the best, sweetie. Make sure you use the good crystal for the toast tomorrow." My mother, Barbara, chimed in right after, sending a message that perfectly encapsulated her entire worldview. The catering team is arriving at noon tomorrow to set up the raw bar. Make sure you hide all of Elise's mail from the entryway console. I absolutely do not want Andre's parents knowing she actually lives there. They think you two bought this place and we need to keep up appearances for his family. I stared at the screen, a cold laugh escaping my chest. My own mother was actively orchestrating a lie to impress my brother-in-law's parents, erasing my existence from my own supposed home just to maintain a fragile illusion of wealth. They were so consumed by their own vanity that they could not see past the tips of their own noses. But the real gift, the absolute crowning jewel of their arrogance, arrived exactly 3 minutes later. My phone buzzed with the new text from Andre. It popped up in the family group chat, a long block of text clearly intended to be a private message to Caroline, but hastily fired off into the wrong thread by a man who was too cocky to double-check his recipient list. I got a buyer for Elise's antique staging vases, Andre wrote. The guy is willing to pay $50,000 in cash. We can easily fence them tomorrow night while the party is going on and the guests are distracted on the balcony. I will just slip them out the service elevator. She is so stupid she will not even notice they are gone until next month, and by then we can just say the cleaning crew broke them. My heart hammered a steady, victorious rhythm against my ribs. I did not panic. I did not respond. I simply took a screenshot. I captured the message, the timestamp, and the sender information. I saved it directly to a secure cloud-based legal folder I had shared with my corporate attorney. Andre had just confessed in writing to a premeditated plot to commit grand larceny. He was actively conspiring to steal what he believed to be $50,000 worth of assets. What Andre did not know, what none of them knew, was that the ornate, heavy-looking vases I had left by the entryway were not my imported 18th-century antiques. Those were safely locked in my new estate. The vases currently sitting in the penthouse were cheap mass-produced resin replicas I had purchased for $50 at a discount warehouse sale years ago. I had spray-painted them gold for a low-budget starter home staging gig and left them behind specifically because I knew Andre's greedy, untrained eyes would lock onto the shiny gold finish and assume they were priceless. I was planning to risk a federal prison sentence over $50 worth of painted plastic. A full 60 seconds passed. Then the message vanished from the group chat. Andre had realized his catastrophic blunder and deleted the text, likely panicking on the other end of the screen. But the internet is forever, and my screenshot was already locked away. I waited to see if my parents would say anything, if they would reprimand him, if a single ounce of parental protectiveness would kick in upon seeing their son-in-law plotting to rob their daughter blind. My mother's next message popped up. Did you guys decide on the floral arrangements for the dining room? I think white orchids would look so much more expensive. She completely ignored it. She had seen the message, seen the plot to steal from me, and simply glossed over it in favor of discussing party decorations. Her complicity was absolute. Her betrayal was total. They were not just taking advantage of me anymore. They were actively participating in my financial ruin. I set my phone down and looked out at my beautiful sunlit pool. The water rippled gently in the breeze. I felt no sorrow, no grief for the family I was losing. They had severed those ties themselves, cutting away the bonds of kinship with every lie, every stolen dollar, and every insult. It was time to give them exactly what they wanted: total, uninterrupted access. I picked up my phone one last time and typed out a message to the group chat, injecting every ounce of fake bubbly enthusiasm I could muster. Have a wonderful party tomorrow, guys, I wrote. I am flying out to Paris for a last-minute design showcase. I will not have any cell service for the next few days, so the place is all yours. Enjoy the weekend. I hit send. I watched the message deliver. I waited just long enough to see Caroline reply with a simple dismissive thumbs-up emoji. Then I held down the power button on my smartphone and swiped the screen. The device powered down the screen, fading to pitch black. I tossed it onto the empty cushion beside me, leaned back in my lounge chair, and closed my eyes. The stage was set. The bait was taken. I was completely unreachable, and they were about to walk straight into a titanium steel cage. Sunday evening arrived with a quiet, settling darkness. At exactly 7 o'clock, I was curled up on the authentic velvet sofa in the private media room of my new suburban estate. The fireplace crackled softly in the corner, casting a warm golden glow across the room. I had a bowl of freshly popped gourmet popcorn resting on my lap, and a classic thriller movie was playing on the massive screen in front of me. My smartphone, the one that tied me to my toxic family and their endless demands, was powered completely down and shoved into the back of a kitchen drawer. I was entirely off it, enjoying a level of absolute peace I had not felt since childhood. I was not worried about the catering. I was not stressed about the guest list. I had completely detached myself from the chaos I knew was currently brewing downtown. While I was enjoying my popcorn in perfect serenity, the scene 30 miles away in the heart of Chicago was painting a very different picture. Caroline, Andre, Barbara, and Richard arrived at the loading dock of my former high-rise building. They were dressed to the absolute nines, fully prepared to play the role of wealthy socialites. Caroline was wearing a glittering birthday tiara and a designer gown she could never actually afford. Andre marched ahead of the group, checking the time on the stolen $4,500 Rolex I had paid for, his chest puffed out with unearned pride. Barbara and Richard trailed close behind, holding bags of cheap party favors and directing the family like they owned the entire city block. They did not walk through the main lobby. They knew better than to try and pass the strict front desk concierge, who would have immediately demanded to see their IDs and called up to the penthouse for authorization. Instead, they used a trick I had foolishly taught them years ago to help them avoid paying for valet parking. They slipped through the underground delivery entrance, bypassing the security desk entirely, and piled into the dingy industrial service elevator. Andre pressed the button for the top floor. The freight elevator groaned and began its slow ascent. Inside the metal box, the family was practically vibrating with excitement. Caroline was already complaining about the lighting in the service elevator, while Andre bragged to Richard about how easily they were going to pull off their fake billionaire aesthetic for his visiting parents. They were laughing, utterly confident in their deception, completely convinced that they had outsmarted the system and bent me to their will. The elevator doors finally slid open, depositing them into the private carpeted hallway that led exclusively to the penthouse door. Barbara strutted forward, reaching into her expensive handbag. She proudly pulled out the freshly cut brass key, the copy she had made after stealing my spare. She slid the key into the deadbolt and turned it. The lock gave way, but it did not feel like a normal lock anymore. Instead of a simple click, the door produced a strange, heavy metallic echo. It was a deep, resonant clunk that reverberated through the thick oak, sounding more like a bank vault being unsealed than a residential front door. Richard pushed the heavy door open and the four of them stepped inside. The foyer was completely dark, save for the ambient city lights spilling in from the floor-to-ceiling windows in the distant living room. They strutted across the threshold, immediately complaining about the lack of lighting and loudly debating where to place the portable bar for the caterers. They were so busy marveling at the space, so utterly consumed by their own vanity and greed, that not a single one of them bothered to look up. If they had just tilted their heads back, they would have seen the sleek, dark glass domes embedded directly into the ceiling panels. These were not standard smoke detectors. They were Dominic Thorne's proprietary biometric scanners, and the exact moment Barbara's foot crossed the threshold, the system silently woke up. High-definition lenses tracked their movements through the dark. Invisible thermal sensors measured their body heat. A faint, nearly imperceptible red glow washed over the family for a fraction of a second. The artificial intelligence grid was rapidly mapping their facial structures, measuring their bone density, and cross-referencing their retinal patterns against a highly classified database of authorized personnel. The system was looking for Dominic Thorne. It was looking for his cleared executive staff. It was looking for the armed security contractors who had been programmed into the safe list. It found absolutely nothing. The facial recognition software returned 4 complete mismatches. No biometric clearance was detected. No authorized access codes had been entered into the digital keypad that was now hidden behind a false wall panel. Miles away, deep inside the subterranean command center of Thorne Cybersecurity, a silent, heavily encrypted alert flared to life on a massive monitor. The artificial intelligence system did not sound a loud blaring alarm inside the penthouse to warn the intruders. It operated with cold, calculated efficiency, designed specifically to trap corporate spies before they could escape with federal data. In the dark ceiling of the penthouse, the sensors locked onto Caroline, Andre, Barbara, and Richard. A silent digital countdown began to run in the background. The artificial intelligence categorized the breach instantly. Intruders detected. Threat level assessing. The sun finally dipped below the Chicago skyline, and the penthouse quickly filled with the sound of clinking crystal and arrogant laughter. 50 guests poured into the expansive living room, completely oblivious to the fact that they were standing inside a highly secured corporate data center. Caroline was in her absolute element. She had actually purchased a sparkling rhinestone tiara for the occasion and was parading around the marble floors in a sweeping designer gown she could never actually afford. Andre was right beside her, playing the perfect host as he schmoozed with his parents, who had just flown in from Atlanta. His parents were highly successful and deeply respectable people. They were the kind of strict professionals who valued hard work, honesty, and building a legitimate legacy. Andre had spent his entire adult life trying to project their level of success without putting in a single ounce of their effort. Now he was gesturing grandly toward the floor-to-ceiling windows, telling his father that he and Caroline had just closed on the property for a cool $4 million. He claimed it was an all-cash deal, paying testament to his booming real estate career. Caroline nodded along, sipping expensive champagne and soaking up the impressed gasps of her friends. They were living out their ultimate fantasy, standing proudly on the foundation of a lie. So massive, it was practically begging to collapse. Across the room, my parents were holding court by the kitchen island, eagerly feeding the massive deception. Richard and Barbara were surrounded by extended family members and Andre's relatives, basking in the glow of reflected glory. I listened to the audio feed later through my security archives, and the sheer audacity of their lies was breathtaking. My father loudly boasted about how he and my mother had helped fund the penthouse purchase. He claimed it was a substantial financial reward for Caroline being such a driven and successful daughter. When one of Andre's aunts politely asked about me, Barbara waved her hand with a loud theatrical sigh. "Elise is out of the country again," she announced, her voice dripping with fake pity and thinly veiled contempt. "She is still playing with her little dollhouses, moving cheap furniture around for open houses. We try to encourage her to find a real career, but she just lacks Caroline's ambition and business sense." The group chuckled, shaking their heads at the tragic story of the struggling, untalented older sister. They were gleefully tearing down my name, my business, and my life, using my supposed failures as a pedestal to elevate themselves in front of high society. The illusion of their power was absolute. They felt completely invincible inside my walls. But while the party raged on with loud music and flowing wine, the cracks in their perfect facade were already starting to form. Andre had a strict schedule to keep and a greedy promise to fulfill. Around 9 o'clock, he signaled two of his shady friends. These were guys from his amateur networking group who always seemed to be looking for a quick illicit payout. Under the guise of giving them a private VIP tour of the master suite, the three men slipped away from the noisy main party and headed straight down the long hallway toward my back office. This was where Andre expected to find the payload. This was the exact room where I normally stored my overflow high-end staging antiques. These were the imported pieces he had proudly promised to fence for $50,000 in cash by midnight. Andre pushed the heavy office door open, a smug, victorious grin plastered across his face, ready to show off his easily stolen inventory. But the grin vanished the instant he flipped on the bright overhead light switch. The room was not filled with 18th century imported vases, vintage Persian rugs, or custom-framed artwork. The room was completely barren of any staging props whatsoever. Instead, sitting dead center on the reinforced hardwood floor were three massive industrial-grade metal crates. They were matte black, incredibly heavy, and secured with thick electronic steel padlocks. Andre stared at the crates in absolute disbelief. His friends shifted uncomfortably, looking around the empty room and asking where the valuable goods were hidden. Panic began to set in rapidly. Andre had already promised his black market buyer a secure delivery by the end of the night, and he had likely already spent the anticipated $50,000 in his head. His initial confusion quickly mutated into a furious, blistering sense of entitlement. He assumed I was playing a petty game with him. He assumed I had intentionally locked my valuable staging antiques inside these ugly metal storage boxes just to spite him and ruin his big financial payout. The sheer audacity of me locking up my own property in my own home was simply too much for his fragile ego to handle. He paced the empty room, cursing my name and promising his friends that he was not going to let a bitter spinster sister-in-law ruin his lucrative deal. Andre marched over to the hallway closet where he had hidden his overnight duffel bag earlier that evening. He unzipped the canvas bag and pulled out a solid steel crowbar. It was a heavy tool he had brought specifically to pry open my storage chests, while the party provided a convenient distraction. He walked right up to the nearest black server crate, completely unaware that he was standing directly beneath a hidden federal security camera. Andre raised the heavy iron crowbar high above his head, gritted his teeth in pure frustration, and brought the metal weapon smashing down onto the electronic lock with a deafening and violent crash. The heavy iron crowbar struck the electronic lock with a bone-jarring impact. Andre expected the metal to snap, or the latch to give way, just like a cheap storage locker. Instead, the reinforced steel lock absorbed the blow entirely, sending a violent shockwave right back up his arms. He stumbled backward, cursing under his breath, dropping the crowbar to the hardwood floor. A sharp, bright blue spark shot out from the damaged digital interface of the crate. Andre and his two friends stared at the small screen embedded in the heavy metal box. The display, previously completely blank, now flashed a rapid, intense sequence of red warning codes. Deep within the walls of the penthouse, fiber optic cables instantly transmitted a catastrophic alert directly to the underground command center of Thorn Cybersecurity. The silent alarm that had been tracking their movements since they walked through the front door immediately upgraded. It was no longer just a case of unauthorized access. It was an active physical attack on federal-level data servers. Out in the expansive main living room, the party was still in full swing. Caroline was standing near the center of the room, her rhinestone tiara catching the light of the crystal chandeliers. She was mid-laugh, leaning in close to Andre's highly respectable, successful parents, bragging about the custom-imported marble countertops she claimed to have hand-selected. Barbara and Richard were nearby holding their wine glasses, nodding along to the fabricated story of their daughter's immense real estate success. Then, without a single second of warning, the upbeat lounge music died. It did not fade out or skip. The sound was severed, instantly replaced by a sudden heavy silence that sucked the air out of the room. A fraction of a second later, the entire penthouse plunged into absolute suffocating darkness. Every chandelier, every recessed light, every decorative lamp shut off simultaneously. For a brief moment, the only illumination came from the ambient city lights of the Chicago skyline pouring through the massive floor-to-ceiling windows. The 50 guests fell completely silent, confused murmurs rippling through the crowd as people assumed it was a simple blown fuse or a temporary building outage. But this was not a power outage, it was a calculated lockdown. A deep, mechanized, whirring sound suddenly reverberated through the walls and ceilings, shaking the floorboards beneath their feet. Hidden compartments above the expansive glass windows snapped open. Thick, solid titanium emergency shutters deployed, dropping from the ceiling with terrifying speed and precision. These were not standard security blinds. They were military-grade blast doors designed to withstand explosives and prevent any possible extraction of corporate assets. The heavy titanium sheets hit the hardwood floors with a synchronized, deafening slam that vibrated right through the teeth of every guest in the room. The beautiful panoramic view of the Chicago skyline completely disappeared, swallowed by thick metal. The penthouse was instantly transformed into an impenetrable black box. Complete chaos erupted. The sophisticated upper-class atmosphere shattered into pure panic. Caroline let out a piercing shriek in the dark. The sound of shattering crystal echoed sharply as she dropped her expensive champagne flute directly onto the marble floor. Guests began bumping into each other, their voices rising in pitch and terror. People scrambled to pull out their smartphones, turning on their harsh, bright flashlights, sending chaotic beams of white light darting across the room. In the frantic glow of the phone screens, the guests saw Andre burst out of the hallway leading from the back office. His face was pale, his eyes wide with genuine terror, and his hands were empty. He had abandoned the crowbar in the back room, realizing too late that whatever he had just hit was not a simple staging prop. He pushed his way through the panicked crowd, searching blindly for his wife, completely unaware of the magnitude of the trap he had just triggered. Suddenly, red emergency strobe lights began pulsing from the ceiling, bathing the entire living room in a harsh, alarming crimson glow. The red light flashed in a rhythmic, disorienting pattern, casting long, nightmarish shadows across the faces of the terrified guests. The surround sound system, previously playing soft jazz, emitted a shrill, ear-piercing siren that forced several people to cover their ears. The siren cut off abruptly. A cold, automated artificial intelligence voice boomed from every speaker in the apartment. The voice was entirely devoid of humanity, flat, metallic, and absolutely terrifying in its certainty. Lethal threat detected, the voice echoed off the walls. Corporate espionage protocols activated. All exits are now sealed. Armed response is 60 seconds away. Lie face down on the floor. The message repeated, cutting through the screams of the guests. Lethal threat detected. Corporate espionage protocols activated. All exits are now sealed. Armed response is 60 seconds away. Lie face down on the floor. Andre's parents stood frozen in the flashing red light, their faces reflecting absolute horror and profound confusion. They turned to Andre, demanding to know what kind of sick joke this was, demanding to know what kind of property he had supposedly purchased. Andre had no answers. His facade of wealth and control had completely evaporated, leaving him stammering and backing away. Barbara grabbed Richard's arm, her perfectly manicured nails digging into his expensive suit jacket. She was screaming over the automated voice, demanding that her husband do something, demanding that he fix this immediately and assert his authority. Richard, desperate to maintain his role as the patriarch of the family, pushed his way aggressively through the crowd of terrified partygoers. He shoved past the fake gold-painted resin vases I had left by the entryway, marching straight toward the heavy front door. He grabbed the solid brass handle, preparing to yank the door open and lead his family out into the hallway, preparing to march down to the lobby and yell at the building management for this catastrophic mistake. Richard pulled on the handle with all his might. The door did not move a single millimeter. It felt as though it had been welded into the wall. He planted his foot against the doorframe, his face turning purple with exertion and terror in the flashing red light, and yanked again with both hands. It was completely useless. The door was magnetically sealed with thousands of pounds of force. There was no keyhole to pick, no latch to break. They were not just locked inside for the night. They were completely trapped inside a dark, flashing red cage, breathing in the cold, recycled air, staring at each other in absolute horror, while the automated voice continued its relentless countdown to their destruction. The 60-second countdown echoing from the automated voice system felt like an eternity, and no time at all. Richard continued to yank frantically on the magnetic front door, his expensive dress shirt soaked with cold sweat. Behind him, the 50 party guests were huddled on the floor, their hands covering their heads as the pulsing red security lights bathed the penthouse in a nightmare glow. Outside the building, the response was terrifyingly fast. Dominic Thorne did not rely on standard emergency dispatch times. His private security firm operated with military precision and was fully integrated with the Chicago Police Department High Threat Division. The distant wail of sirens quickly transformed into a deafening roar as multiple squad cars and armored tactical vehicles swarmed the downtown street block below. Then came the heavy, rhythmic thumping of helicopter blades. The vibrations rattled the floorboards even through the thick titanium shutters that had sealed the apartment. Intense, blinding white spotlights from the choppers outside pierced through the tiny structural seams of the metal barricades, sweeping across the dark living room like searchlights over a prison yard. The automated voice cut off precisely as the countdown hit 0. For 3 agonizing seconds, there was nothing but the sound of 50 people weeping and praying in the dark. Then heavy, synchronized footsteps echoed in the private hallway right outside the penthouse. Someone shouted a muffled command through the thick walls. A massive, concussive boom shook the entire top floor. The blast was so powerful it knocked Richard straight off his feet and sent him tumbling backward onto the marble foyer. The reinforced oak front door, which just days prior I had wiped clean with lemon polish, was blown entirely off its heavy steel hinges. It crashed onto the floor in a cloud of thick, acrid smoke and splintered wood. Before the dust could even begin to settle, dozens of tactical officers in heavy black body armor streamed through the doorway. They moved with terrifying coordinated speed. Dozens of red laser sights sliced through the smoky air, dancing wildly across the designer gowns, custom suits, and terrified faces of the party guests. Get on the ground right now. Keep your hands where we can see them. Do not move a single inch. The officers screamed their commands, their voices booming over the chaos. The upper-class, sophisticated atmosphere of the fake billionaire lifestyle was completely obliterated. Wealthy socialites and business professionals were shoved face first onto the hardwood floors, their expensive champagne mixing with the dust of the breached door. Caroline was sobbing hysterically in the center of the living room. The cheap rhinestone birthday tiara she had been parading around in slipped off her head and shattered beneath the heavy combat boot of a tactical officer. She shrieked in absolute terror as rough hands forced her down, pressing her perfectly made-up face directly into the cold, sticky floor. Her designer gown bunched up around her as she was swiftly zip-tied, her screams completely ignored by the professionals securing the room. Down the hallway in the back office, Andre was entirely frozen in panic. When the door breached, he had tried to scramble away from the metal server crates, but the room offered no escape. A specialized unit of Thorn cybersecurity contractors kicked the office door open. Their tactical flashlights blinded him instantly. Andre was caught standing directly next to the heavily damaged federal data server, the solid steel crowbar still resting on the floor right at his feet. He raised his hands, stammering, trying to use his smooth-talking real estate broker voice to explain away the situation. But you cannot negotiate your way out of a federal breach. Two contractors tackled him hard. He was slammed face first onto the ground with enough force to knock the wind out of his lungs. The heavy metal handcuffs clicked tightly around his wrists, biting into his skin right next to the $4,500 Rolex he had forced me to pay for. The officers dragged Andre out of the back office and hauled him into the center of the main living area to join the rest of the detained family. Andre's parents, the highly successful, respectable professionals who had flown in from Atlanta, were kneeling on the floor just a few feet away. They watched in absolute, unadulterated horror as their son was shoved to his knees in handcuffs. They had spent their lives building a clean, honorable legacy, and now they were watching their son being treated like a common thief in what they thought was his own home. An officer stood over Andre, loudly reading him his Miranda rights. "You have the right to remain silent," the officer barked, listing off the preliminary charges of federal property damage, breaking and entering, and corporate espionage. Andre looked up at his parents, his eyes wide with a desperate, pleading look, but his father simply turned his face away in profound shame and disgust. The illusion of the golden, successful couple was dead. Across the room, my mother Barbara was thrashing wildly against the zip ties binding her wrists. Even while pinned to the floor, her toxic entitlement refused to accept the reality of the situation. She genuinely believed that her status as my mother made her invincible. "You cannot do this to us!" Barbara screamed at the top of her lungs, spitting dust as she glared up at the arresting officer. "You have absolutely no right to be here. My daughter Elise owns this entire place. This is her penthouse. Call her right now on the phone. When she finds out what you did, she will have every single one of you fired and stripped of your badges." The tactical officer looked down at her, his expression entirely hidden behind his riot visor, but his tone dripped with cold, hard amusement. He scoffed, grabbing her arms and tightening the plastic zip ties until they bit into her skin. "Lady," the officer replied flatly, "the woman who owned this place sold it to a federal contractor 3 days ago. You broke into a government-secured data facility. Nobody is getting fired today except your lawyer." The holding cell was a cold, unforgiving slab of gray concrete and steel. At midnight, the fluorescent lights buzzed with a harsh clinical hum that exposed every flaw and failure of the people trapped beneath them. Caroline, Andre, Barbara, and Richard sat huddled on a single metal bench, still wearing their ruined, dust-covered party clothes. Caroline's expensive designer gown was torn at the hem, and her face was a catastrophic mess of streaked mascara and smudged eyeliner. She looked absolutely nothing like the confident, wealthy socialite who had been sipping champagne on a luxury balcony just hours before. The initial shock of the SWAT raid had worn off immediately, replaced by the vicious, inevitable cycle of a toxic family turning on itself. The blame game erupted before the heavy cell door even locked behind them. "This is all your fault," Andre hissed, turning on Caroline with a sudden venomous intensity. His wrists were bruised from the handcuffs, and he rubbed them furiously as he glared at his wife. "If you had not been so obsessed with showing off to my parents, we never would have been here. You had to have the perfect birthday party. You had to pretend we owned this place." "My fault!" Caroline shrieked, her voice echoing shrilly off the concrete walls. "You are the one who brought a crowbar to my birthday party. You are the one who tried to smash open a federal data server. I just wanted a nice dinner and you turned it into a felony." Richard paced the small, cramped cell like a caged animal, his expensive suit jacket stained with dust and sweat from being thrown onto the marble floor. He was not angry at Andre. He was not angry at Caroline. His fury, as always, was entirely directed at the person who was not even in the room. "Elise is going to pay for this." Richard yelled, his voice rough with exhaustion and pure, unadulterated entitlement. "This is a complete misunderstanding. She probably forgot to pay the security bill, or she messed up the alarm system. That useless girl cannot do a single thing right. The second we get out of here, I am making her pay for my dry cleaning and every single legal fee." Barbara sat silently for a moment, clutching her ruined designer purse against her chest. She watched her husband pace and her daughter cry, her mind racing to find a way to manipulate the situation back in her favor. She stood up, smoothing her wrinkled skirt, and walked over to the heavy metal door, flagging down a passing officer. "Excuse me," Barbara demanded, her tone dripping with the same condescending authority she used on restaurant servers and retail workers. "We are permitted one phone call. I need to use it immediately." The officer did not say a word. He simply unlocked the cell, escorted her to a wall-mounted phone in the processing area, and stood by with his arm crossed. 30 miles away, in the quiet, absolute serenity of my hidden suburban estate, I was sitting at my expansive kitchen island. The house was perfectly silent, save for the soft hum of the refrigerator. I was holding a steaming mug of chamomile tea, wearing a comfortable plush sweater, completely unbothered by the chaos unfolding downtown. My phone, which I had powered back on specifically for this moment, began to vibrate on the marble counter. The caller ID displayed the main number for the Chicago Police Department Central Precinct. I did not pick up immediately. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my tea. I let the phone ring once, twice, 3 times. I wanted Barbara to sweat. I wanted her to feel the rising panic of being completely ignored. On the 4th ring, I finally answered, keeping my voice perfectly calm, soft, and entirely pleasant. "Hello," I said. "Get down here and bail us out immediately!" Barbara screamed into the receiver. Her voice was so loud and frantic, I actually had to pull the phone slightly away from my ear. "Elise, this is not a joke. The police broke down the door. They arrested all of us. You need to get down to the precinct right now and tell the police you gave us permission to be in your apartment. Tell them it was a huge misunderstanding and you want the charges dropped." I smiled, looking out the window into the dark, peaceful woods surrounding my property. I could hear the sheer terror in her voice, the desperate need to exert control over a situation she had entirely lost. She still believed I was her obedient, terrified daughter. She still believed she could snap her fingers and make me fix her mistakes. I took another slow, deeply satisfying sip of my tea. "I will be right there, Mom," I replied, my voice steady and soothing. "Just sit tight. I am on my way." I hung up the phone before she could say another word. I did not rush. I walked upstairs to my closet, taking my time as I selected a razor-sharp, impeccably tailored designer suit. I pulled my hair back into a sleek, professional style. I was not going to the precinct as a frightened daughter rushing to save her family. I was going as a successful, independent CEO preparing to bury them. The drive to the Central Police Precinct took exactly 22 minutes. I did not speed. I did not run any red lights or frantically weave through the late-night Chicago traffic. I drove completely within the speed limit, enjoying the quiet hum of my car engine and the peaceful glow of the streetlights passing by. For my entire life, an urgent phone call from my mother meant dropping absolutely everything to rush to her aid. It meant putting my own life on hold to manage whatever crisis she or Caroline had caused. It meant panic, high blood pressure, and a desperate scramble to fix things so I would not have to endure their relentless complaining. But tonight was different. Tonight I was not rushing to save them. I was arriving to finalize their destruction. I did not throw on a pair of old sweatpants or rush out the door looking like a terrified, sleep-deprived daughter. I took my time. I walked into my expansive walk-in closet and selected a razor-sharp tailored charcoal gray designer suit. I slipped on my most expensive stiletto heels and pulled my hair back into a sleek, flawless professional style. I wanted to look exactly like the highly successful chief executive officer they had spent years mocking. When I pulled up to the precinct, two men in impeccable dark suits were already waiting for me by the entrance. These were not public defenders. They were two senior partners from the elite corporate law firm that represented my staging business. I had called them the moment my mother hung up the phone. We exchanged brief professional nods, and together the three of us walked through the heavy double doors of the police station in perfect synchronization. The precinct at 2 in the morning was a miserable, depressing place. The harsh fluorescent lights buzzed incessantly overhead, casting a sickly pale glow over the scuffed linoleum floors. The air smelled of stale coffee, cheap floor wax, and pure desperation. Usually the people walking into this room at this hour were exhausted parents bailing out reckless teenagers or tearful spouses paying for terrible mistakes. I was neither of those things. I walked with my head held high, the sharp click of my heels echoing off the concrete walls, commanding immediate attention from the exhausted officers on duty. It did not take long for the shouting to start. Through the thick, reinforced glass of the holding area, my father spotted me. Richard was standing near the front of the crowded, dingy cell, and the moment he saw my face, his reaction was not one of relief or gratitude. It was pure, unadulterated arrogance. He gripped the metal bars, his face turning an ugly shade of red. Finally, Richard bellowed, his voice carrying over the low murmur of the busy station. He did not ask how I was. He did not say thank you for coming. Tell these idiot cops to take the cuffs off right now. Do you have any idea how long we have been sitting on this filthy concrete? And you are paying for my dry cleaning, Elise. This jacket is completely ruined. Behind him I could see the rest of the family. The sight of them was almost cinematic in its perfection. They were covered in a fine layer of gray dust from the tactical breach of the penthouse door. Caroline was sitting on a cold metal bench, sobbing uncontrollably. The cheap rhinestone birthday tiara she had been so proud of was gone, and her expensive designer gown was torn at the hem. Andre was pacing the back of the cell looking furious and terrified, the heavy metal handcuffs still secured tightly around his wrists. Barbara was clutching her ruined purse, glaring at me through the glass, as if this entire situation was somehow my failure. In the past, this is the exact moment I would have crumbled. I would have scrambled to the front desk, apologized profusely to the officers, paid whatever astronomical fines were required, and begged for my family's forgiveness for an inconvenience I did not even cause. I would have taken the blame just to make the yelling stop. Not tonight. Tonight I did not even flinch. I did not look in their direction. I did not acknowledge their demands or their anger. I walked right past the holding cell as if it were entirely empty, heading straight for the main processing desk. A seasoned officer was waiting there, looking exhausted with a tall stack of paperwork resting in front of him. His name tag read, Detective Ramirez. He looked up, expecting to see a weeping family member ready to open her checkbook. Instead, he saw a woman radiating absolute authority, flanked by high-powered corporate attorneys carrying thick leather briefcases. Detective Ramirez, I said, extending my hand with a polite professional smile. I am Elise. I received a frantic, rather aggressive phone call from the suspects currently occupying your holding cell. I deliberately used the word suspects. I saw the detective raise an eyebrow, clearly intrigued by my cold demeanor. He shook my hand, standing up slightly straighter. Yes, he replied. They said you are the owner of the property they were found in. They have been causing quite a disturbance, demanding we contact you to sort out this trespassing issue and post their bail. I let out a soft, polite sigh, shaking my head, as if I were dealing with a minor, unfortunate administrative error. I am afraid there has been a massive mistake on their end, Detective. I continued smoothly, my voice projecting clearly across the quiet room so that every single word would carry over to the holding cell. I am not here to post bail. In fact, I cannot bail them out. The sound of my father's yelling abruptly stopped. The holding cell went deathly quiet. Suddenly, Caroline shoved her way past Richard, pressing her tear-stained face flat against the reinforced glass of the cell window. Her eyes were wide with rising panic, finally registering that my tone was not submissive. "What are you talking about?" Caroline shrieked, her voice muffled but frantic through the heavy glass. "Elise, stop playing games right now. Tell them it is your house so we can get out of here. Tell them you let us throw the party." I turned slowly. I looked directly at my sister, taking in her ruined dress, her streaked makeup, and the absolute terror radiating from her eyes. I did not raise my voice. I did not sound angry. I spoke with a chilling, absolute calm that echoed through the quiet precinct, sealing their fate with a single sentence. "But it isn't my house, Caroline," I said, maintaining direct eye contact with her. "I sold it last Wednesday." The absolute silence that followed my declaration was deafening. Inside the holding cell, Caroline stared at me with her mouth hanging open, her brain completely short-circuiting as it tried to process the words I had just spoken. Richard stopped pacing. Barbara gripped the metal bars so tightly her knuckles turned a stark, bruised white. Even Andre, who had been furious just moments before, looked up from the concrete floor with a sudden dawning look of pure terror. I turned my back on them. I had given them exactly enough time to let the reality of their situation sink into their bones, and now I had business to conduct. I looked back at Detective Ramirez. The seasoned officer was watching me with a mixture of shock and profound respect. He had seen a lot of family disputes in his precinct, but he had clearly never seen someone dismantle a group of entitled trespassers with such surgical precision. I gestured to the senior corporate attorney standing to my right. Without a single word, the lawyer stepped forward and placed a sleek black leather briefcase onto the detective's scarred wooden desk. He unclasped the locks, opened it, and pulled out a thick, heavy stack of papers. It was the 50-page closing document for the sale of the penthouse. "Detective Ramirez," my attorney said, his voice carrying the smooth, unwavering authority of a man who billed thousands of dollars an hour. "My client Elise is the former owner of the property in question. As you will see on page 4 of this legally binding contract, the title of the penthouse was officially transferred to Thorn Cybersecurity last Wednesday. The funds cleared, the escrow closed, and my client relinquished all legal rights, access, and responsibilities to the property at exactly 5 o'clock on Friday afternoon." Detective Ramirez took the thick stack of papers. He adjusted his glasses and began flipping through the heavily notarized documents. He checked the signatures, the federal stamps, and the time logs. Behind me, the shock in the holding cell finally shattered, giving way to absolute, unadulterated panic. "You sold it!" Barbara gasped, her voice trembling so violently it cracked. The color completely drained from her face, leaving her looking hollow and sickly under the harsh fluorescent lights. "But you told us you were going to Paris. You left your spare keys on the kitchen counter for us. You sent a message in the family group chat wishing us a wonderful party." I slowly turned my head to look over my shoulder at the woman who had spent my entire life manipulating me. I did not raise my voice. I did not sound angry or vindictive. I tilted my head, my voice completely devoid of any emotion, delivering the cold, hard facts of her own disastrous choices. "I never gave you keys, Mom," I said, keeping my gaze locked directly onto hers. "You stole my spares. I never gave you permission to be there. You broke in. I sent a text message wishing you a nice weekend, but a text message is not a legally binding property deed. And I certainly never told you to break past a biometric lock, bypass the lobby security, and throw a 50-person party inside a federally secured corporate data center." Richard grabbed the bars of the cell, shaking them in a sudden fit of rage. "You set us up!" he bellowed, his face turning a dangerous shade of crimson. "You purposely left those keys out. You knew we were going to throw a party. You planned this whole thing just to humiliate your sister. Tell this detective to let us go right now. We are your family." My attorney stepped slightly in front of me, shielding me from my father's outburst. "Detective," my attorney said calmly, "my client has absolutely no authority to drop these charges or authorize their release. Thorn Cybersecurity is the sole owner of the property." The automated lockdown and subsequent police dispatch were triggered by the buyer's proprietary artificial intelligence security grid, which was activated after my client surrendered the premises. She has zero legal standing here. She cannot bail them out and she cannot undo their arrests. Detective Ramirez nodded slowly, closing the thick folder of closing documents. He looked at the paperwork, then looked past me, his eyes locking onto Andre, who was cowering in the back of the holding cell. Well, at least Detective Ramirez said, his tone shifting from investigative to deeply serious. I appreciate you coming down here to clear up the chain of ownership. It certainly explains why the tactical response was so aggressive. But I am afraid your family's problems go far beyond simple trespassing and throwing an unauthorized party. Caroline began to sob loudly, covering her face with her dirt-stained hands. What else could there possibly be? She cried out. We just wanted to have a nice birthday dinner. We did not know it was a data center. We thought it was an empty apartment. The detective did not look at Caroline. He kept his eyes entirely fixed on Andre. It gets much worse. Detective Ramirez stated, his voice echoing loudly enough for every single person in the holding cell to hear. The private security contractors from Thorn Cybersecurity just sent over the preliminary incident report, along with the high-definition video files they extracted from the hidden cameras inside the back office. Andre swallowed hard. He took a step backward, hitting the concrete wall of the cell, his eyes darting frantically around the small space, as if looking for an escape route that did not exist. We pulled the security footage from the server room. Detective Ramirez continued tapping his pen against the desk. We have your son-in-law on tape, clear as day. We have him walking into a restricted federal data room, picking up a heavy steel crowbar, and actively trying to smash open encrypted federal data servers. Barbara let out a horrifying, breathless gasp. Richard stumbled backward, clutching his chest. Caroline slowly turned her head to look at her husband, her face twisted in a mask of pure, absolute horror. Andre was not just facing a trespassing fine anymore. He had taken a weapon to federal corporate property, and the entire devastating act was captured in high definition. The trap I had set had worked perfectly, but Andre's own unchecked greed had just handed him a federal prison sentence. Andre dropped to his knees on the concrete floor of the holding cell with a dull, heavy thud. The color completely drained from his face as the detective's words echoed in the cramped, sterile space. He had been caught on high-definition camera, attacking federal data servers with a solid steel crowbar. Caroline scrambled away from him, pressing her back against the cold metal bars, looking at her husband as if he were a complete stranger. Barbara covered her mouth in absolute terror, her eyes darting frantically between the detective and me, desperately searching for any possible loophole to escape this nightmare. There were no loopholes left to find, and I was not finished dismantling them. I stepped forward, smoothing the front of my tailored suit jacket, and smoothly pulled a sleek iPad from my designer handbag. I unlocked the screen with a quick tap, the bright, harsh light illuminating the grim, dust-covered faces of my family behind the reinforced glass. Detective Ramirez, I said, my voice cutting through the heavy silence of the precinct with absolute chilling clarity. While Mr. Thorne will certainly handle the federal security breach regarding his servers, I have my own separate charges to file tonight. I also have security footage from my personal hidden cameras recorded in the days leading up to the official sale of the property. Richard swallowed hard, his hands trembling where they gripped the bars of the holding cell. I turned the iPad around and set it flat on the detective's desk, hitting the play button. The high-definition video filled the screen. It was crystal clear, time-stamped, and utterly undeniable. I had installed those discrete cameras months ago because I knew exactly who my family was. I knew their greed had no bottom. The footage showed the interior of my penthouse late Thursday evening. On the screen, Richard and Andre were working together, sweating and straining as they carefully wrapped and carried out 3 massive ornate antique vases and 2 imported velvet armchairs. That is not what it looks like, Richard stammered, his voice cracking under the weight of his own lies. We were just helping you clear out the junk you left behind. You told us to get rid of your old staging props for the birthday party. We were doing you a favor, Elise. You cannot show that to the police. I did not even blink. I reached out and tapped the screen to pause the video right on a perfectly lit frame of Andre's face as he carried a vase out the front door. Those were not junk, I replied, my tone absolutely glacial. Those pieces were authentic museum-grade staging antiques belonging entirely to my corporation. The total insured value of the items you removed from my property that night is exactly $45,000. The detective leaned forward, his eyes narrowing as he watched the footage replay. He looked back at Richard, who was now sweating profusely under the harsh precinct lights. And it goes far beyond simple theft. I continued speaking clearly and deliberately, so the precinct audio recorders would pick up every single syllable. Andre proudly announced his intentions in a written text message to the family group chat, which I have already provided to your office. He stated he had a private buyer lined up to fence my property for $50,000 in cash. Furthermore, he explicitly arranged to transport those stolen goods across state lines to a private buyer in Indiana to fund his fabricated luxury lifestyle. I took a deliberate step closer to the glass, looking directly into my father's terrified eyes. They crossed state lines to sell my corporate assets to fund their lifestyle. I stated clearly, letting the absolute gravity of the law crush their remaining defiance. That is interstate grand larceny. I am pressing full charges against both of you. The words hit Richard like a physical blow to the chest. He staggered backward, his hands flying up to clutch his shirt right over his heart. He gasped for air, his knees buckling as he collapsed heavily onto the metal bench beside Caroline. The realization that his comfortable retirement, his pristine country club reputation, and his freedom were all entirely gone washed over him in real time. He was no longer a respected patriarch. He was an exposed, documented thief facing a lengthy federal prison sentence. Andre completely broke down. The flashy, arrogant real estate broker facade dissolved into pure, pathetic panic. He dropped his head to the filthy concrete floor and started crying loud, heavy, heaving sobs that echoed miserably through the holding area. Please, Andre begged, crawling toward the front of the cell, his handcuffed wrists scraping against the floor. Please, Elise, I am sorry. I will get the stuff back. I will pay you back every cent. Just drop the charges. I cannot go to federal prison. Please, you have to help me. Right at that exact moment, the heavy double doors of the precinct swung open. Andre's parents walked into the processing area. They had been called earlier when the tactical team first raided the building, and they had rushed down to the station to see what kind of terrible misunderstanding had occurred. They were highly successful, deeply respectable people from Atlanta who had spent their entire lives building a spotless family legacy. They walked in just in time to hear the detective summarize the federal server damage, and they stood close enough to the desk to clearly see the high-definition iPad footage of their son stealing $45,000 worth of antiques. Andre looked up through his tears and saw his mother and father standing there. Mom. Dad, Andre cried out, reaching his bound hands toward the glass. Please, you have to get me a lawyer. You have to post my bail. Tell them I did not mean it. Tell them it was a mistake. I need your help. His parents stood frozen in the center of the precinct. They looked at the video playing on the desk. They looked at the sobbing, pathetic man on the floor of the holding cell. The profound shame and absolute disgust radiating from their faces was palpable. They had worked too hard and sacrificed too much to have their family name dragged through the mud by a greedy, grifting son who had resorted to interstate grand larceny just to pretend he was rich. His father adjusted his coat, his jaw set in a hard, unforgiving line. He looked at Andre one last time, his expression completely devoid of any parental warmth or sympathy. Then, without speaking a single word, he turned his back on his son. He took his wife by the arm, and the two of them walked straight out of the precinct doors, leaving Andre to rot in the mess he had created. The ultimate crushing rejection was complete. Caroline screamed in horror as her in-laws abandoned them, but her cries were immediately cut short by the sound of the precinct doors swinging open once again. The air in the room seemed to chill instantly. A tall, imposing man in a flawless, custom-tailored black suit strode into the processing area. He did not look around. He did not introduce himself to the desk sergeant. He walked with the lethal, predatory confidence of a man who destroyed lives for a living. This was Dominic Thorne's lead corporate litigator, a ruthless shark of a lawyer who handled the cybersecurity firm's most aggressive legal battles. He walked directly up to Detective Ramirez's desk and slammed a heavy, solid steel briefcase down onto the wood with a deafening crack. The entire room jumped. The holding cell went dead silent. The lawyer did not even glance at my family cowering behind the glass. He kept his eyes locked strictly on the detective, his voice booming with absolute terrifying authority. My client is pressing charges for corporate espionage, breaking and entering, and $250,000 in property damage. The corporate lawyer's declaration hung in the stagnant air of the precinct like a death sentence. $250,000 in property damage, corporate espionage, breaking and entering. Those words carried the heavy, undeniable weight of total financial and personal ruin. The reality of what was happening finally crashed down onto my family. They were not going to talk their way out of this. They were not going to write a small check and walk away. They were facing decades in federal prison and a mountain of debt that would completely liquidate everything they owned. The sudden staggering shift in power was an incredible thing to witness. For my entire life, my parents had stood on a pedestal of their own making, looking down at me with absolute disdain. Now that pedestal was crumbling into dust right before my eyes. Barbara, the woman who cared more about her country club reputation than her own flesh and blood, completely broke down. The arrogant matriarch vanished, replaced by a terrified, desperate woman facing the total destruction of her comfortable life. Her legs gave out. She fell hard onto her knees on the filthy concrete floor of the holding cell. She scrambled forward, her torn designer dress pooling around her, and she reached her arms through the gaps in the cold steel bars. She grabbed the metal tightly, her knuckles turning white as she wept hysterically. Her mascara ran down her face in dark, ugly streaks. "Elise, please," Barbara wailed, her voice cracking with raw, unadulterated panic. "Please, you have to stop this. You have to tell them to drop these charges. We are your family. You cannot let them do this to us. We raised you, Elise. We gave you everything. You cannot just stand there and watch us lose our lives." The sheer audacity of her plea was staggering. Even now, with her hands gripping the bars of a jail cell, she was trying to use the concept of family to manipulate me into saving her. She was trying to weaponize the very relationship she had spent 33 years destroying. I did not back away from the holding cell. I did not avert my eyes or look to my attorneys for guidance. I walked right up to the steel bars, stopping just inches away from my mother's reaching hands. I looked down at her, kneeling on the concrete, and I felt absolutely no pity. I felt nothing but a profound, liberating sense of justice. "You raised me to be your punching bag," I said, my voice echoing clearly and firmly across the quiet precinct. "You did not raise me with love or support. You raised me to be a convenient target for your own insecurities. You stole from me to fund Caroline's vanity. You stood in my kitchen just days ago and forced me to sleep on a couch in my own home so your golden child could have my bed." I leaned in slightly closer, making sure she heard every single syllable. "You did not treat me like family," I continued, my tone cold and unwavering. "You treated me like an ATM. You treated me like a servant who existed solely to finance the luxury lifestyle you all felt entitled to. You spent my entire life telling me I was a failure, and yet you had no problem breaking into my home to steal my corporate assets to pay for your fake billionaire aesthetic. You are not my family. You are just the people who happen to share my genetics, and tonight, you are just criminals facing the consequences of your own greed." Richard stepped up behind Barbara, his face pale and haggard. He opened his mouth to argue, to command me to listen to him like he always did, but the words died in his throat. He looked at the corporate lawyer standing behind me. He looked at the high-definition footage, still paused on the detective's desk, and he finally realized he had absolutely no power left. He slumped backward against the concrete wall, completely defeated. Then, from the dark corner of the cell, Caroline let out a loud, pathetic sob. She crawled forward, pushing past her mother. She looked completely ruined. The expensive birthday gown she had paraded around in was covered in dust and grime from being tackled by the tactical team. Her carefully styled hair was a tangled mess. The cheap rhinestone tiara she had worn to celebrate her 30th birthday lay broken in pieces on the floor behind her. But even in the face of federal charges, Caroline's narcissism remained her only priority. She was not crying because she felt guilty for stealing from me. She was not crying because she realized how cruelly she had treated her older sister. "My life is ruined," Caroline sobbed, gripping the bars and looking up at me with wide, panicked eyes. "My friends saw me in handcuffs, Elise. They all saw the police throw me onto the floor. Andre is going to jail. His parents just walked out on us. I have absolutely nothing left. Everyone is going to know what happened. You have to fix this. You have to tell them it was a mistake. I cannot go to prison. I cannot be a convicted felon. She was crying for her social status. She was mourning the death of the fake image she had spent years carefully curating. She genuinely believed that her embarrassment was a greater tragedy than the fact that she and her husband had committed interstate grand larceny. I looked down at my younger sister. I looked at the golden child who had been handed every advantage, every privilege, and every ounce of our parents' affection, only to squander it all on pure, unadulterated greed. I felt absolute ice in my veins. "You wanted my house so badly, Caroline," I said, my voice dropping to a terrifyingly calm whisper. "You wanted to play the wealthy socialite. You wanted to impress your friends with a life you did not earn and a penthouse you did not buy. Well, congratulations. You got exactly what you wanted. You threw the party of the century in a multi-million-dollar property." I took a step back from the cell, turning my back on their tear-stained faces and desperate pleas. "Now you get to pay for it," I stated, tossing the words over my shoulder without a single ounce of remorse. "Have a great 30th birthday." I walked away from the holding cell, leaving the precinct processing area, with my legal team right beside me. Behind me, the sound of Caroline's hysterical screaming and Barbara's desperate sobbing echoed against the cold concrete walls. I did not turn around. I did not stop walking. I stepped out through the heavy double doors of the police station and into the cool, refreshing Chicago night air. The heavy chains of my past had finally been severed, and tomorrow morning, they would face the judge for their arraignment. The weekend passed with agonizing slowness for the 4 people sitting in county lockup, but for me, it was the most peaceful 2 days of my entire life. When Monday morning finally arrived, the heavy, imposing oak doors of the federal courthouse in downtown Chicago swung open. I walked into the courtroom exactly 15 minutes early. I wore a pristine, cream-colored tailored suit, holding a simple leather briefcase, and took a seat in the second row of the gallery. To my left sat my corporate attorney. To my right sat Dominic Thorne's lead litigator, the man who had formally filed the catastrophic civil suits over the weekend. We did not speak. We simply waited in the cold, quiet majesty of the legal system. At exactly 9 o'clock, the heavy side door near the judge's bench clicked open. The sound of heavy metal chains rattling against the polished hardwood floor echoed through the silent courtroom. A line of bailiffs escorted my family into the room. The breath caught in my throat not out of pity, but out of sheer, unadulterated awe at the absolute destruction of their carefully crafted vanity. They were all wearing oversized, bright orange standard-issue jail jumpsuits. Their wrists were handcuffed and secured to thick leather belly chains. Their ankles were shackled. Caroline, the golden child, who had spent her entire life demanding absolute perfection and luxury, looked completely unrecognizable. Her blonde hair was a matted, greasy bird's nest. Her face was swollen, splotchy, and entirely devoid of the expensive makeup she used to mask her insecurities. She shuffled forward in cheap plastic jail slip-ons, a far cry from the designer stilettos she had worn to her ill-fated 30th birthday party. Barbara walked behind her, looking as though she had aged 20 years over a single weekend. The arrogant country club matriarch was gone. She kept her head bowed, staring at the floor, shivering in the cold over air-conditioned courtroom. Richard followed, his shoulders slumped, the proud patriarch completely broken by the reality of the federal justice system. Andre brought up the rear, his eyes darting frantically around the room like a cornered animal desperately searching for an exit. They were directed to stand behind the long defense table. As they turned to face the front, Richard's eyes scanned the gallery. He saw me sitting there, pristine and untouched by their ruin. He opened his mouth as if to say something, but a bailiff immediately put a firm hand on his shoulder, forcing him to turn back around. The bailiff announced the arrival of the judge, a stern, no-nonsense federal magistrate who had absolutely zero patience for white-collar entitlement. She took her seat at the high bench, adjusted her reading glasses, and opened the massive file sitting in front of her. "We are here for the arraignment of Caroline Andre." Richard and Barbara, the judge, began, her voice ringing out with terrifying absolute authority. The defendants are facing multiple federal and state charges stemming from a coordinated breach of a secured corporate data facility. The judge looked down at the paper, reading the charges aloud for the public record. The defendants are formally charged with breaking and entering, she stated, her voice cold and steady. Conspiracy to commit interstate grand larceny regarding the theft and attempted sale of $45,000 in corporate staging assets. Destruction of private property, resulting in $250,000 in damages to federal data servers. And finally, corporate espionage. Caroline let out a loud, pathetic whimper at the word espionage. The gravity of the federal charges was finally crushing the last of her delusions. These were not slap-on-the-wrist misdemeanors. These were severe felonies carrying mandatory minimum prison sentences. The prosecuting attorney stepped up to the podium to address the issue of bail. Your Honor, the prosecutor said, given the severity of the charges and the premeditated nature of the crimes, the state requests significant bail. Defendant Andre was caught on camera attempting to destroy federal data servers and has a documented plan to fence stolen goods across state lines. We consider him a severe flight risk and a danger to corporate security. The judge nodded, looking over the prosecutor's notes. I agree. Bail for Andre is set at $1 million. Andre gasped, his knees buckling slightly as he leaned against the defense table to keep from collapsing. $1 million was a staggering, impossible number. For the remaining 3 defendants, the judge continued, not missing a single beat, given their participation in the burglary and the property damage. Bail is set at $250,000 each. Richard immediately stepped forward, pulling against his heavy handcuffs. His country club arrogance flared up one last time as he tried to exert his usual authority over a situation he could not control. Your Honor, please, Richard pleaded, using his best, most respectful businessman voice. I am a retired professional. I have a substantial pension. My wife and I own a beautiful home in the suburbs. We are upstanding citizens of this community. We can post the 10% bond right now if you just let me make a phone call to my bank. This is a massive misunderstanding involving my daughter. The judge stopped him, peering over her glasses with a look of absolute chilling pity. Sir, I strongly advise you to consult with your public defender before making any further statements about your finances, the judge said flatly. The court has been notified this morning that Thorn Cybersecurity, along with the legal representatives for the staging corporation you stole from, have successfully filed emergency civil injunctions against you and your entire family. Richard froze. What does that mean? He asked, his voice suddenly very small. Dominic Thorne's ruthless litigator, sitting right next to me, stood up and addressed the judge. Your Honor, as of 8 o'clock this morning, every single bank account, investment portfolio, and pension fund belonging to these defendants has been completely frozen by federal order, pending damage restitution. Furthermore, liens have been placed on all of their physical properties. They do not have access to a single dollar. The color drained entirely from Richard's face. He looked back at Barbara, who let out a horrifying, breathless gasp before collapsing heavily into her plastic chair, burying her face in her shackled hands. The illusion of their wealth was gone. They had absolutely nothing. They could not pay a bail bondsman. They could not hire private defense attorneys. They were entirely destitute, entirely by their own design. The judge struck her gavel against the sounding block. Bail conditions are set. The defendants will be remanded to county custody until trial. Bailiffs take them back. The officers immediately moved in, grabbing the defendants by their arms to lead them back through the heavy side door. The reality of going back to the miserable concrete cells with no hope of a quick bailout triggered a spectacular, violent implosion. Andre dug his heels into the floor, fighting against the bailiff's grip. He turned his head and locked his furious, terrified eyes onto his wife. He did not look at her with love. He looked at her with pure, unadulterated hatred. "This is your fault!" Andre screamed at the top of his lungs, his voice echoing violently through the courtroom. You ruined my life. You needed that stupid penthouse to show off to your fake friends. You are a pathetic, broke loser, and I am filing for divorce. The second I get a phone call, I am done with you. Caroline shrieked, pulling against her own chains as she tried to lunge at the man she had just spent years parading around as her perfect husband. I hate you. Caroline sobbed hysterically, her voice cracking as the bailiffs dragged her backward through the heavy wooden doors. "You are nothing but a cheap thief. You ruined my birthday." The doors slammed shut behind them, cutting off the sounds of their vicious, bitter, screaming match. The picture-perfect golden couple, the pride and joy of my parents' superficial existence, had just violently and publicly destroyed each other right in the middle of a federal courtroom. I remained seated in the gallery, my posture perfectly straight, my hands resting calmly on my leather briefcase. I did not smile. I did not gloat. I simply watched the empty space where my family had just been standing, feeling nothing but the clean, crisp reality of absolute justice. 2 weeks passed since the arraignment. The wheels of the federal justice system ground forward with a ruthless mechanical efficiency that my family was completely unprepared to face. Richard and Barbara had spent decades cultivating a flawless image of impenetrable upper-class wealth. They lived in a sprawling, meticulously manicured suburban estate that served as a physical monument to their extreme arrogance. That monument was currently being dismantled piece by piece right in front of their eyes. I sat parked in my heavily tinted car at the far end of their pristine cul-de-sac, sipping a hot matcha latte, simply observing the inevitable process. Federal marshals had officially seized the property to begin liquidating their assets. The financial damages owed to Thorne Cybersecurity and my own real estate staging corporation were astronomically high. Because Dominic Thorne's legal team had successfully frozen every single one of their bank accounts and pension funds, the courts came directly for their physical possessions. Professional movers marched in and out of the grand front doors in a relentless stream. They carried out heavy antique furniture, massive flat-screen televisions, expensive Persian rugs, and high-end artwork. Barbara stood on the sidewalk at the edge of the property line, clutching a cheap plastic shopping bag, holding the few basic personal items she was permitted to keep. She was watching her entire identity being loaded into the back of a commercial moving truck. Richard was pacing near the driveway, futilely waving a stack of useless documents at a federal marshal who completely ignored him. But the absolute true punishment was not the loss of their expensive furniture. It was the audience. This was a highly exclusive neighborhood where local gossip was the primary currency. Several of Barbara's wealthy country club friends were slowly driving by in their luxury SUVs. They did not stop their vehicles to offer comfort. They did not step out to help. Instead, they rolled down their tinted windows, whispering eagerly to each other and taking photos with their smartphones. The social standing my mother had prioritized over her own daughter's well-being was completely and utterly pulverized. She tried to hide her face behind her trembling hands, weeping openly as the very people she used to desperately impress documented her total financial ruin. Meanwhile, Caroline was experiencing her own spectacular fall from grace. She had somehow managed to scrape together just enough money to cover the non-refundable 10% fee for a bail bondsman. She had completely depleted the very last penny she had hidden away in a secret separate checking account to get out of the county holding cell. But freedom came with a harsh, unforgiving reality check. With her assets frozen and her reputation completely destroyed by the highly publicized SWAT raid, not a single one of her high society friends would return her calls. Her husband's parents had cut them both off completely. She had absolutely nowhere to go. The golden child, who had demanded a 5-star catering team and a luxury downtown penthouse for her 30th birthday, was now living in a dingy roadside motel on the industrial outskirts of the city. It was the kind of depressing place with flickering neon signs in the parking lot, stained carpets, and vending machines secured behind iron cages. Desperation breeds intense predictability. My phone vibrated in my pocket. It was a blocked number, but the voicemail notification that popped up on my screen took only a second to identify. I pressed play. "Elise, please pick up," Caroline sobbed into the receiver. Her voice lacked the sharp, demanding edge of entitlement it usually carried. It was high-pitched, pathetic, and dripping with calculated manipulation. "I am so scared. I am staying in this horrible motel, and I do not even have money for food. You have to believe me, Elise. I had no idea Andre was going to steal your staging things or smash those servers. He manipulated me. Mom and Dad pressured me into going along with the party. I was a victim in all of this. I am your little sister. Please just send me some money. Just help me get out of here. I listened to the entire voicemail while standing in the grand foyer of my actual newly purchased suburban estate. The acoustics in the room were absolutely perfect. The vaulted ceilings allowed the sound of her pathetic weeping to echo softly against the imported Italian marble floors. Warm sunlight poured through the massive skylight above, illuminating the authentic museum-grade artwork I had safely secured on my own walls. I was surrounded by the beautiful, quiet luxury I had built entirely with my own two hands. I looked down at the audio file on my phone screen. Caroline was playing her favorite lifelong game. She was casting herself as the helpless victim and throwing her husband entirely under the bus to save her own skin. She genuinely thought she could use our blood tie to extract one last financial favor from me. She thought her tears would erase the fact that she had demanded I sleep on a couch so she could steal my home. I did not text her back. I did not send her a single dollar for food. Instead, I tapped the forward button on the audio file. I opened my email application and typed in the direct email address of the aggressive, high-priced federal defense attorney who had been appointed to represent Andre in his upcoming trial. Caroline had just provided a clear recorded confession blaming the entire break-in and property damage squarely on her husband and her parents, while simultaneously admitting she was present and fully aware of the events. By sending that voicemail, she had completely broken any concept of spousal privilege. I hit send, ensuring that when they finally went to trial, the so-called perfect couple would possess the exact ammunition needed to completely and violently destroy each other in front of a federal judge. The federal courthouse was a chillingly sterile environment, a place where illusions of grandeur went to die. Andre sat at the defense table, his expensive tailored suit replaced by a drab, ill-fitting outfit his public defender had scrounged together. His high-priced defense attorney had dropped him the moment Dominic Thorne froze the family assets, leaving Andre to rely on an overworked state-appointed lawyer who looked completely exhausted before the trial even began. I sat quietly in the very back row of the gallery, wearing a crisp navy blazer and matching trousers, my hands folded neatly in my lap. I was not there to testify. The digital evidence and security footage spoke volumes on my behalf, requiring no further input from me. I was simply there to watch the final curtain fall on their arrogance. Andre took the stand on the second day of the trial, his posture radiating a desperate, fabricated confidence. His entire defense strategy was built on a flimsy foundation of supposed family misunderstandings. He looked directly at the jury, his voice dripping with practiced sincerity, and claimed that I had given him explicit verbal permission to clear out my old unwanted staging props. He testified that the entire incident was just a tragic miscommunication between relatives, that I had told him to take whatever I left behind to help fund his new life with my sister, and that the damage to the federal servers was a complete accident caused by his confusion in the dark. He painted himself as an innocent victim of a bitter sister-in-law who was using a simple property mix-up to destroy his professional life. The prosecuting attorney stepped up to the podium, holding a very familiar stack of printed documents. He did not yell or badger Andre. He simply projected my family group chat logs onto the large courtroom monitors. He highlighted the exact message where I cheerfully announced I was flying to Paris and would have no cell service. The prosecutor asked Andre a very simple question. If he had explicit verbal permission to take those items, why did he send a text message to his wife bragging about fencing the vases for $50,000 in cash while I was out of the country? Andre stammered, his smooth-talking facade cracking instantly under the harsh fluorescent lights. He tried to claim it was a joke, a sarcastic comment taken out of context that the police were blowing out of proportion. That was when the prosecutor played the audio file. It was the exact voicemail Caroline had left me from her dingy motel room, the one I had thoughtfully forwarded to the defense and prosecution alike. Caroline's pathetic weeping voice echoed through the massive federal courtroom. She threw Andre entirely under the bus, sobbing about how she had no idea he was going to steal my staging antiques, blaming his uncontrollable greed, and admitting they both knew they were doing something wrong by sneaking behind my back. Andre stared at his defense attorney in absolute horror, realizing his own wife had provided the state with a recorded confession that completely obliterated his verbal permission defense. He looked at Caroline in the gallery, his face twisting in betrayal, but she refused to meet his gaze. The trial did not drag on. The evidence was too overwhelming, the digital footprint too massive, and the physical security footage too damning for any jury to debate. They were dismissed to deliberate, and they returned to the courtroom in less than 2 hours. We all stood as the foreperson handed the paperwork to the bailiff. The judge read the verdict aloud. Andre was found guilty of interstate grand larceny and the willful destruction of private corporate property. The judge did not mince words during the sentencing phase. She looked down at Andre with absolute disgust, citing his blatant greed, his total lack of remorse, and his willingness to destroy a secure federal facility for a quick payout. She slammed her gavel down, sentencing him to a mandatory 5 years in a federal penitentiary. The moment the sentence was handed down, the courtroom erupted into absolute chaos. Caroline, who had been sitting 2 rows ahead of me, sprang to her feet and let out a blood-curdling scream. She was not crying out of heartbreak for the man she loved. She was not mourning the loss of her husband. She screamed because the reality of her situation had just become permanent. She was officially legally tethered to a convicted federal felon, drowning in insurmountable civil debt, and completely stripped of her golden child status. She shrieked at the judge, wailing that her life was ruined, that she could never show her face in high society again, and that she was completely broke. She cried for her lost luxury, entirely indifferent to the man being handcuffed a few feet away. Sitting across the aisle from Caroline were Andre's parents. The highly successful, deeply respectable professionals from Atlanta stood up from the wooden benches. They did not rush forward to comfort their son. They did not offer Caroline a shoulder to cry on. They looked at the two of them with a cold, profound revulsion that cut deeper than any prison sentence ever could. Without saying a single word, Andre's father buttoned his suit jacket, placed his hand on his wife's back, and guided her toward the heavy wooden exit doors. They walked out of the courtroom with their heads held high, publicly and permanently severing all ties with the son and daughter-in-law who had brought such unparalleled humiliation to their family name. The perfect flashy couple that had tormented me for years was completely eradicated in a matter of seconds. The bailiffs moved in, grabbing Andre by the arms to escort him away to processing. The remaining gallery attendees began to file out into the hallway. I remained seated in the back row, my expression perfectly serene, watching the wreckage settle. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw movement near the defense table. My father, Richard, who had been sitting near the front, slowly turned his head. His expensive clothes hung loosely on his shrinking frame, his face lined with the deep, permanent exhaustion of a man who had lost absolutely everything. He looked past the screaming Caroline and the handcuffed Andre. His eyes locked directly onto mine across the empty wooden benches. The arrogant patriarch who had demanded I sleep on a couch and pay for his son-in-law's Rolex was completely gone. Richard looked utterly, irreparably broken. He did not raise his voice or make a scene. He simply looked at me, the daughter he had spent a lifetime treating like garbage, and silently mouthed the word sorry. The crushing reality of Andre receiving a 5-year federal prison sentence sent a massive, unavoidable shockwave through the rest of my family. Richard and Barbara had watched their golden son-in-law get dragged away in handcuffs, and in that exact moment, the final remaining fragments of their arrogant delusion evaporated completely. They finally understood that the federal justice system did not care about their former country club memberships, their previously manicured suburban lawn, or the fake image of upper-class superiority they had spent decades building. The law only cared about the evidence, and the evidence against my parents was absolutely insurmountable. With all of their financial assets completely frozen by Dominic Thorne's ruthless corporate litigators, my parents had absolutely no money left to mount a defense. Their sprawling estate had been seized, their pension funds were locked. They could not afford to hire the slick, aggressive defense attorneys they so desperately needed. Instead, they found themselves sitting in a cramped, sterile room at the public defender's office, listening to an overworked, underpaid state lawyer explain the bleak reality of their situation. The prosecutor offered them a single, non-negotiable plea deal. If they took the case to trial, the high-definition security footage of them carrying my expensive staging inventory out of the penthouse would guarantee a conviction for interstate grand larceny, carrying a mandatory minimum prison sentence. To avoid spending the last years of their lives rotting behind bars in a federal penitentiary, Richard and Barbara had to swallow every single ounce of their massive pride. They had to stand before a federal judge, place their hands on a Bible, and publicly plead guilty to criminal trespassing and conspiracy to commit theft. The sentencing hearing was a swift and deeply humiliating affair. The judge looked down from the bench at my parents, who were standing with their heads bowed, looking frail and completely defeated. The judge did not hold back. She delivered a scathing reprimand, admonishing them for their blatant greed, their staggering sense of entitlement, and their willingness to exploit their own daughter for financial gain. To spare the taxpayers the cost of housing them in a federal facility, the judge handed down a sentence designed to completely shatter their fragile egos. Richard and Barbara were sentenced to 5 years of strict, heavily monitored federal probation. But the true punishment, the condition that made my mother physically gasp in the quiet courtroom, was the community service requirement. They were ordered to complete 1,000 hours of mandatory supervised manual labor. Specifically, they were assigned to a municipal sanitation crew. The judge made the terms abundantly clear. If they missed a single check-in with their probation officer, or if they failed to complete their assigned physical labor for any reason, their probation would be immediately revoked, and they would be sent directly to federal prison to serve out the remainder of their sentence behind bars. Fast forward 3 weeks. The brutal, inescapable reality of their new life was in full swing. It was a sweltering, oppressive Tuesday afternoon in the middle of July. The Chicago sun was beating down mercilessly on the cracked asphalt of a busy highway overpass. Cars and massive semi-trucks sped past at 70 miles an hour, kicking up thick clouds of choking dust, hot exhaust fumes, and gritty road debris. Barbara, the woman who just weeks ago had been draped in my custom-imported silk robes, sipping my most expensive vintage wine, and demanding a 5-star catering team for a fake billionaire birthday party, was now forced to wear a cheap, oversized neon orange high-visibility safety vest. Her perfectly colored hair was matted to her forehead with sweat and grime. Her manicured nails were chipped and broken, hidden inside thick, heavy-duty industrial work gloves. She was holding a long metal trash grabber in one hand and dragging a heavy, foul-smelling plastic garbage bag with the other. She walked slowly along the muddy, litter-strewn shoulder of the highway, her shoulders slumped under the blazing, unforgiving heat. She was forced to pick up discarded fast food wrappers, empty soda bottles, and rotting food scraps thrown from the windows of passing cars. Every time a truck roared past, a blast of hot, dirty air hit her directly in the face. A few yards away, Richard was struggling to lift a heavy, mud-caked, discarded tire out of a ditch. He looked like a hollow, exhausted shell of the proud patriarch who had once confidently tossed a $4,500 Rolex bill onto my kitchen counter and ordered me to pay it. This was their new normal. There were no more lavish dinner parties. There were no more country club brunches or boastful conversations about their immense success. There was only the grueling, humiliating reality of manual labor in the harsh public eye, cleaning up the very city streets they used to look down their noses at from the comfort of their luxury vehicles. Barbara dragged her heavy trash bag along a particularly filthy stretch of the overpass, her chest heaving as she struggled to catch her breath in the humid air. She spotted a crumpled, glossy piece of paper stuck in the muddy grass near the guardrail. She let out a miserable sigh, raised her metal grabber, and speared the trash to lift it from the dirt. As she pulled the paper closer to drop it into her plastic bag, her eyes caught something familiar. She paused, pulling off one of her heavy work gloves to take the paper from the metal grabber. It was a torn page from a recent issue of a premier, highly respected national business magazine. The heavy stock paper was crumpled and stained with mud, but the image printed on it was perfectly clear. Barbara unfolded the page with her dirty, blistered fingers. Her breath caught sharply in her throat. It was a full-page feature advertisement for my luxury real estate staging firm. Taking up the entire page was a beautiful, high-definition professional photograph of me. I was wearing a sharp-tailored designer suit standing confidently in the center of a stunning multi-million-dollar property. I looked powerful, radiant, and incredibly successful. The bold, black headline printed directly above my smiling face praised my company as the absolute pinnacle of luxury real estate design in the Midwest. Barbara stood frozen on the side of the loud, filthy highway. She stared at the crumpled magazine page, the blazing sun beating down on her neon orange vest. The absolute crushing irony of the universe finally broke whatever tiny fragment of spirit she had left. She fell to her knees in the dirt, clutching the picture of the daughter she had thrown away, and began to weep. While our parents were spending their afternoons picking up garbage on the side of a sweltering highway, my sister was facing a completely different kind of personal hell. The glorious, untouchable bubble of the golden child had finally burst, leaving Caroline completely exposed to a reality she was entirely unequipped to handle. With her bank accounts completely drained by legal fees and civil restitution, Caroline had been evicted from the cheap motel she had initially fled to. She had absolutely no marketable skills, no college degree she had ever actually utilized, and a fresh, highly publicized felony record attached to her name. The wealthy socialites she used to impress had blocked her number the second the news of the SWAT raid broke. Her husband was sitting in a federal penitentiary. She had absolutely no one left to manipulate. To meet the strict requirements of her federal probation, Caroline was forced to secure immediate employment. She found herself working a grueling minimum wage retail job at a discount department store on the outskirts of the city. The woman who had once demanded a five-star catering team for her 30th birthday was now spending her days folding cheap sweaters and scrubbing fitting room floors under the harsh glare of fluorescent lights. But old habits are incredibly hard to break, and Caroline's deep-seated narcissism convinced her she still possessed one final trump card. She genuinely believed that because we shared the same genetics, I would eventually cave and rescue her from her miserable existence. It was a rainy Tuesday afternoon. I was standing in my expansive corner office on the top floor of my corporate building in downtown Chicago, reviewing a series of imported fabric swatches for a highly lucrative upcoming project. The city stretched out beautifully behind the floor-to-ceiling windows, a sprawling testament to the empire I had built entirely on my own. My desk phone rang, breaking the quiet focus of the room. It was my front desk receptionist, and she sounded incredibly uncomfortable. "Elise, I am so sorry to interrupt you," my receptionist said, keeping her voice low. "There is a woman down here in the main lobby causing a massive scene. She says she is your sister and she is demanding to be led up to your office. She is crying hysterically and absolutely refusing to leave the premises. Security is standing by." I knew exactly who it was. I did not panic and I did not feel a single ounce of anxiety. "Tell security to hold their position," I replied calmly. "Do not let her pass the turnstiles. I will be right down." I did not send my security team to throw her out blindly. I wanted to handle this myself. I wanted to look my sister in the eye one final time and make sure she understood exactly where she stood in my world. I stepped out of my private elevator and walked into the gleaming, expansive marble lobby of my corporate building. The space was pristine, echoing with the quiet professionalism of high-level executives coming and going. Caroline was standing near the security desk, and the sight of her was almost jarring. She was wearing a cheap, poorly fitting polyester retail uniform. Her name tag was pinned crookedly to her chest. Her blonde hair was pulled back into a messy, unwashed knot, and her face was streaked with desperate tears. When she saw me walking toward her in a flawless, custom-tailored designer suit, she lunged forward. "Elise," she sobbed loudly, reaching her hands out across the security barrier as if trying to grab my arm. "Please, Elise, you have to help me. I have absolutely nothing left. I am working minimum wage. I can barely afford to eat. I am living in a miserable, tiny apartment with 3 roommates who hate me. My life is completely destroyed." 2 security guards immediately stepped forward to intercept her, but I held up my hand, signaling them to stop. I stood just out of her reach, looking at her weeping face. "I am your blood," Caroline wailed, her voice echoing shrilly across the marble lobby, drawing the stares of passing professionals. "I am your little sister. We are family. You have all this money and this huge company. Please just give me a job. Let me stay in your guest house. I will do anything you want." You cannot just leave me to rot like this. I did not raise my voice. I did not show a single flash of anger or vindictiveness. I looked at the woman who had tormented me for my entire life with absolute terrifying indifference. You are not my family, I stated, my voice cutting through the lobby like a blade of solid ice. You are a convicted trespasser. You are a thief who conspired to steal my corporate assets to fund a fake lifestyle. You are a grown woman experiencing the very real consequences of your own bottomless greed. Caroline stared at me, her mouth falling open as her tears temporarily stopped. She had expected me to yell. She had expected a dramatic argument where she could play the victim. She had no idea how to process absolute unwavering apathy. If you ever step foot in my building again, I continued, maintaining dead, unblinking eye contact with her, I will personally call your federal probation officer and have you immediately arrested for violating the terms of your release. You will serve the remainder of your sentence in a prison cell right alongside your husband. The reality of my words hit her like a physical strike to the chest. The spell of the golden child was permanently shattered. She finally realized that her tears held absolutely no currency here. The real world did not care who her parents had favored, and I was no longer her scapegoat. Caroline's legs gave out. She collapsed right onto the cold marble floor of the lobby in a full hysterical tantrum. She pounded her fists against the ground, screaming and wailing about how unfair her life was and how everyone had abandoned her. But no one came to her rescue. The wealthy professionals and corporate executives walking through the lobby simply stepped around her, weeping form, glancing down with mild disgust, before continuing on with their successful lives. She was completely, entirely alone, forced to face a world with absolutely no safety net. I gave a brief silent nod to my security team. They stepped forward, grabbed Caroline firmly by the arms, and dragged her sobbing, thrashing body out the heavy glass doors and into the pouring Chicago rain. I turned my back on her for the final time. I walked back into the private elevator, the doors sliding shut, completely blocking out the sound of her miserable existence. I returned to my serene, quiet corner office and walked over to the massive window looking out over the sprawling city skyline that I had conquered on my own terms. I took a deep, refreshing breath of the perfectly climate-controlled air. My office door opened softly behind me. My executive assistant walked in carrying a thick leather-bound document with a massive, triumphant smile on her face. I just got off the phone with Dominic Thorne's legal team, my assistant announced, setting the heavy contract down onto my polished desk. He just purchased a brand new $70 million mega mansion on the lakefront, and he is requesting that you be the exclusive staging director for the entire estate. 6 months passed since the day I had my sister removed from my corporate lobby. Half a year is a remarkable amount of time when you are no longer spending every waking moment managing the manufactured crises of highly toxic people. The biting Chicago autumn had transitioned into a bitter, freezing winter, but inside my hidden suburban estate, everything was radiating absolute warmth and undeniable success. I had spent those 6 months pouring my energy entirely into my business. The $70 million mega mansion project for Dominic Thorne had been a monumental triumph. My staging design was featured in 3 major architectural magazines, cementing my firm as the undisputed leader in high-end real estate presentation across the entire Midwest. My corporate profits had tripled, and my personal wealth was secured in diversified, untouchable trusts. But the greatest achievement of all was not financial. It was the profound, unbroken silence that now filled my daily life. It was the Wednesday evening right before Thanksgiving. I was hosting an intimate, meticulously curated dinner party in the grand dining room of my estate. The long mahogany table was set with authentic vintage crystal-polished silver and a breathtaking centerpiece of winter florals. A personal chef I had hired for the evening was busy in the kitchen, sending the rich, savory aromas of roasted duck and truffle potatoes drifting through the vaulted hallways. I sat at the head of the table wearing a simple but flawlessly tailored emerald green dress, holding a glass of imported red wine. I looked down the length of the table at the guests I had hand-selected to share my home. There was my dedicated warehouse manager, the man who had flawlessly executed the ghost move of my inventory under the cover of night. There were my two sharp corporate attorneys who were currently laughing at a joke instead of drafting emergency cease and desist orders. And sitting to my right was Dominic Thorne. He was no longer just the paranoid, intimidating billionaire who had purchased my downtown penthouse. Over the course of the mega mansion project, a deep mutual professional respect had formed between us. He raised his glass to me, his sharp eyes catching the light of the crystal chandelier overhead. He thanked me for transforming his new property into a masterpiece, and joked that his artificial intelligence security grid was running perfectly without any unwanted family members trying to smash his servers with crowbars. We all shared a genuine hearty laugh at the memory. I leaned back in my plush velvet chair, letting the joyous sound of my chosen family wash over me. I took a moment to truly reflect on the profound difference between this evening and every single holiday I had endured for the past 3 decades. I looked around my beautiful, secure home. There was absolutely no anxiety twisting in my stomach. There was no one aggressively demanding that I hand over my credit card to fund a fake, flashy lifestyle. There was no arrogant brother-in-law pacing my floors wearing a watch I had been forced to pay for. There was no golden child sister throwing a tantrum because she wanted my master bedroom. There was no controlling mother ordering me to grab a blanket and sleep on my own couch just to accommodate her favorites. Every person sitting at my table tonight was here because they respected me. They valued my intellect, my work ethic, and my company. I had reclaimed my physical space, my financial independence, and my mental peace. I had systematically cut away the parasitic rot that had been dragging me down, and in doing so, I had finally allowed myself to thrive. Just as the chef began to bring out the main courses, a soft, brief vibration broke my reverie. My smartphone resting face down next to my wine glass had just received a message. I did not panic. I calmly picked up the device and unlocked the screen. It was a text message from an unsaved unknown number. But the moment I read the first few words, I knew exactly who had sent it. "Elise, it is Mom," the message read. The tone was pathetic, stripped of all its former country club arrogance. "We are using a prepaid phone. Richard and I have absolutely nothing to eat for Thanksgiving tomorrow. Caroline lost her retail job and cannot help us. We are freezing in this awful neighborhood. Please, Elise, we are so sorry for everything. We were wrong. We need you. Please come get us." I stared at the glowing screen for a long, quiet moment. I read the words, absorbing the sheer desperate reality of their situation. They were broke hungry and facing the harsh, unforgiving consequences of their own spectacular greed. They had pushed me away, stolen from me, and tried to ruin my life, and now they were begging the scapegoat to swoop in and save them from the prison they had built with their own hands. A younger version of me would have felt a sharp pang of guilt. A younger version of me would have excused myself from the dinner table, grabbed my car keys, and rushed out into the freezing Chicago night to buy them a massive turkey and pay their heating bill. But that version of me was dead and gone. A faint, peaceful smile touched my lips. I did not type out a furious response. I did not send a long, vindictive paragraph gloating about my massive success or reminding her of the time she made me sleep on the floor. They were not worth a single second of my energy or a single syllable of my time. I simply tapped the options menu on the screen, hit block number, and confirmed the action. I locked the phone, silencing it completely, and dropped it into my designer purse hanging on the back of my chair. I picked up my glass of expensive red wine and stood up. The conversation around the dining table naturally faded as my guests turned their attention toward me, smiling in anticipation. I held my glass high, looking at the incredible people who supported me, protected me, and valued me for exactly who I was. "To new beginnings," I said, my voice ringing clear, confident, and completely free of the past. "And to unbreakable locks." My guests raised their glasses in unison, echoing the toast with bright, cheerful voices. I took a slow, deeply satisfying sip of the rich red wine. I was standing in my own castle, surrounded by genuine warmth, while the people who had tried to destroy me were left out in the cold, trapped forever in the miserable reality they had created for themselves. I had won. Sometimes the most profound lesson we can learn in life is that toxic family dynamics do not change just because we sacrifice our own happiness to accommodate them. For years, I believed that if I just worked harder and gave more, my parents would finally respect me. But the reality is that manipulators only view your generosity as a weakness to be exploited. True freedom comes the exact moment you stop seeking validation from people who are committed to misunderstanding your worth. Walking away from these people who diminish you is not an act of cruelty. It is the ultimate act of self-preservation. You have every right to protect your peace, your assets, and your future. If you resonated with this story, please share your own experiences with setting boundaries in the comments below. Do not forget to hit that like button and subscribe for more empowering stories.